This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi, everyone. Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife Podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Welcome aboard. We're really glad to have you. Hey, take a few moments of your time here and make sure you subscribe to our channel and also join us on Facebook for our Facebook page. We have hundreds of individuals and we're pest control operators and wildlife control operators sharing ideas and triumphs and despairs in working so we can help you make more money and service the clients that you have. Well, we have a special guest here today. His name is Jordi Segers, and he is the person in charge or managing the National White Nose Syndrome. And he's the coordinator of the National White Nose Syndrome Program in Canada. And he's located at Prince Edward Island. If you ever get a chance to get up there, you definitely want to check out Prince Edward Island. It is a gorgeous location. So welcome aboard.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, you've done some, what got you involved in this particular job that you're in right now?
Well, bats are an interesting topic, interesting creatures to study. As a lot of your listeners might know that in recent years, in about the last 10 years, bat populations of certain species have plummeted due to a disease called white nose syndrome, which is in my job title. So it's kind of a hot topic to study, and in my case, coordinating our national program to try to mitigate the threat of white nose syndrome to bats is just it's an important job to do, bringing everything together, everyone who's working on bats, bringing them together, making sure resources are out there. And to put it simple, easier said than done is to prevent species extinction, really.
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem, and those of you in the audience should certainly know about white nose syndrome. It is a significant threat to a major income source for many of our listeners, and also bats provide a lot of important what they call environmental services, right, to our ecosystems in terms of their helping to manage insects and just be part of the ecosystem. We don't want to have bats go extinct. So you're coordinating with the U.S. because obviously the U.S. this is where it started, of course, here in North America, and of course it spread up to Canada. Do you have caves that are contaminated? Do you have the same number of caves that we do here in the U.S.? I mean, explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we work very closely with our American partners. So there's a similar position to mine. There's a national white nose syndrome program coordinator in the United States as well, working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And of course, we don't want to be reinventing the wheel on any research that's done that may help bats, or any research that's done that just helps us understand the progression of this disease and other threats to bats. We basically, my week is a lot of my work time in a week is taken up by communicating with the US partners and of course with Canadian partners, and communicating back and forth really. And yeah, as you mentioned, the US, there's a lot of caves there. White nose syndrome was first found in Albany, in New York State. In this really big show cave where there's a lot of foot traffic there. Thousands of people visit that site every year. And likely the way white nose syndrome, or the pathogen, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, the way that it was brought to North America was likely on someone's boots or clothing, just accidentally. You couldn't even have predicted it. No one could have predicted it. But picking something up, a fungus in Europe, and then bringing it to North America, and accidentally infecting the bats that way. So that was in the Appalachian Mountains. And of course, that regions of caves and karsts goes up through eastern Canada as well.
Okay.
So it was no surprise that first it was found in 2006 in Albany, New York,
Mhm.
and it started spreading in 2010. It was also the disease and the pathogen were found in Ontario and Quebec here in Canada. And from there, it spread to other eastern provinces. So all the maritime provinces, all the Atlantic provinces. And it's gone south, it's gone west, it's gone in all directions now.
So in terms of Canada, you now have it. You have it in Ontario and Quebec, and I would guess New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Prince Edward Island has it now too.
Prince Edward
Labrador.
It hasn't been found in Labrador yet.
Okay.
It has been found west as far as Manitoba now.
Okay. Wow. So not not in British Columbia yet then.
No, but that's an interesting one. And I'll quickly pull up the map here.
Yeah.
So just as an illustration that you can see where the disease has been found.
Okay.
So yeah, you can see all through eastern United States and Canada. And here, this red blob here is western Manitoba.
Gotcha. Okay.
As a big surprise, a couple of years ago, it jumped from kind of the Midwest right to Washington State. We don't have any answers as to how it got there. Likely human mediated, because bats typically don't fly this distance. We're talking about
that's a long ways. Yeah.
Miles. Yeah. So in British Columbia and Alberta in the Western provinces, as well as in the other Western states, California, for example, they're doing white nose syndrome surveillance. They're trying to figure out if the disease or the fungus without the disease is in the West there. So British Columbia and Alberta have not detected either yet, but some of the Western states, they have detected the fungus. So the fungus that causes the disease, but sometimes it doesn't cause the disease depending on the bat species. And sometimes we're only able to find the fungus, and without an actual bat to carry the fungus, we of course don't know if there are any bats that are affected by the disease.
Right. Okay. So I think there's some confusion and maybe some misunderstanding on our part as technicians out in the field or something. And that is, there's a specific way that these terms are defined, right? Because they have. So can you discuss a little bit about what the criteria is for them to turn that map, a part of that map, red? Like in my state here in Montana, we have a spot in the eastern edge of our state where they found white noses here. What's the criteria that they use? It's clearly not just the presence of the fungus. It has to be on a bat. Is that kind of how that works?
Yes. Yeah. So, and that's very good that you bring that up, because we're constantly trying to clarify that difference between pathogen and disease. So pathogen being the fungus, the presence of the fungus, and when it causes disease. So I'm going to have to simplify the story because it's pathologists and epidemiologists, researchers that are on a level that's even beyond my understanding.
Sure.
But they set these case criteria, and they're the ones who get to see bat carcasses in their lab and have to diagnose, does this bat actually have the disease? So indeed, you can find the fungus that can cause the disease. You can find it on a bat without any other signs. Like all organisms are constantly covered in different fungal species. We are covered in fungal species. And as long as we're not immunocompromised, most of these fungal species actually don't do anything to us. But if you have a cut in the skin or something and your immune system in that sense is compromised, some of these microorganisms are able to take hold and are basically able to cause an infection. So so what we need to diagnose a bat with white nose syndrome is, yes, indeed, we typically need a carcass of a bat. We could do it on live bats as well, but it's a little trickier, so easier on a dead bat. So first of all, we have to confirm that the fungus is on the bat. That's one. And we have to do that with genetic analysis. So really confirm the genetic makeup, the DNA of this fungus, because there's plenty of other fungal species out there that look the same or might even cause similar things to happen to the skin, but aren't the same. So yeah, we confirm that the fungus is on there. And then typically as a second, we need to be able to see lesions on the wings. So we really need to see microscopically that this fungus has infiltrated the skin and has actually destroyed the skin. And when I'm talking about skin, I'm typically talking about the wings or the nose skin of these bats, because the wings is really where this fungus does the most damage. Of course, bats need their wings for flying, for water regulation, for a lot of things. So when it destroys their skin tissue, their wing tissue, that's when these bats actually get sick and usually get thirsty because water balance is all out of whack. And they wake up or arouse from their hibernation state way too often. They burn through their fat reserves before winter is over, and they basically are hungry, looking for insects. But in winter, in most parts of North America, there are no insects to eat, and they starve to death.
So I understand that California had some findings, but they were inconclusive, and so they weren't. So that's why California on our map here is not showing up, even though they have a suspicion that something may be going on there. So they're just waiting for that. Does it require just one bat, or is it require multiple bats to have enough certainty that it's there? Is it just one?
So yeah, you're right that in California, indeed, they were looking for the fungus, and sometimes these tests are inconclusive. It's very complicated, but basically in the amplification of the DNA, there might be something there, but the sample wasn't strong enough to indicate that it was actually this fungus. It might have been something closely related. So again, we're talking here about potential detection of the fungus, but not the disease. There's no talk about the disease yet, because it hasn't been shown to do anything to bats there. Which makes sense, because if you haven't conclusively found the fungus yet, you can't have conclusively found the disease yet. And indeed, really all it takes, and that's what happened in Washington state, the first detection was a single bat that was found, a dead bat, where they did the genetic analysis on a swab. They confirmed, yes, the fungus is conclusively there. And looking at the wing membranes of this bat under the microscope, they could see that its wings were affected by the fungus. So yes, in that case, one bat is all it takes. Yeah.
All it takes. I know this is a little out of your field, but maybe not. Clearly, one of the concerns that we have in our industry is, are we hindering, or are we hindering the bats in the sense that, are we going to be a vector for transmitting some of these this fungus as we're doing bat exclusion work on structures? The National Wildlife Control Operators Association has a protocol for people in terms of how they're dealing with bats. And the question that I would have, and that is it enough or is it too much? Certainly we want people to use clean one-way doors rather than just moving them from one place to another. That they're going through the cleaning process, or maybe even better yet, just tossing it in the trash. But I think bleach kills. They just drop, some of them are plastic, just drop them in bleach and leave it there for a while. But I don't see any work being done in the research community on this particular question. And it's a little bit of a concern for me because of some of our technicians, some of our companies, they specialize in bat work and they do a lot of bad work. So the amplification process could be huge. Any thoughts on that?
So the disease white nose syndrome is something that affects bats in winter only when they're hibernating. But that pathogen, that fungus that causes that disease, can be carried to their summering sites. So to these attics, for example, where these bats might roost. And even though it doesn't cause a disease right there, it does mean that if someone goes into an attic, if you actually have to go into the attic, or indeed if these bats use these one-way tubes, they touch the tubes,
right.
And then you take that tube somewhere else, the fungus could potentially be on there. And without taking thorough swabs and sending it to a lab to do expensive testing,
right.
You don't know if it's there or not. So there is a potential, of course, for someone to use these tubes, say in, I'm just going to talk about Canada because that's where I'm at.
Sure.
Use these tubes on a building in Ontario, and we know white nose syndrome, and as well as this fungus that causes it, is prevalent in that area. This is probably a very hypothetical situation, but what if that tube is then moved and is used in Alberta or British Columbia? Bats are potentially able to pick up the spores of this fungus that are left behind. And then when they go to their wintering sites and they go into hibernation, it could express itself as the disease. And now this fungus can grow and can spread to other bats. So it's all really about the travel, like how much do you travel these tools? From our perspective as a conservation biologist, yes, we'd rather be safe than sorry, and we'd rather go over the top in our precautions, or at least in what we recommend. But I understand from a industry perspective, where you have to make money, throwing your tubes away every time, or even cleaning them with bleach, is gonna significantly shorten the lifespan of anything. It's going to cost a lot more money. So you may have to make decisions on, well, if you're working within a what we call a white nose syndrome endemic zone, where white nose syndrome has been established, it's been there for a long time, you do not leave that zone. If the state and provincial legislation, if there is any that applies to that, if they allow, then it could be okay to use the same equipment and to not have to do thorough decontamination. But that really just depends on where you are and what your state regulations are, because some of these things are actually regulated. And
yeah, I'm not aware of any state regulations yet. I do know that the protocol for NUCOA is that that if you're going to reuse a tube, then you have to clean it, and that's part of the protocol. Otherwise, you're in violation of the ethics code and your certification requirements for those that are certified. But of course, the problem is enforcement, right? So you want people to use their better angels, appeal to their better angels, but and sometimes, and that just doesn't even account for mistakes. It's sometimes a person just busy and just forgets because of the stress load. Are there regulations in Canada on the management of bats by wildlife control operators? The few conversations that I've had with individuals, it seems much more chaotic than what we have here in the U.S. Which is unusual because Canada is so much more regulated on all other aspects of life. It's like, really? Canada hasn't gotten this straightened out yet? How is that possible? It's sort of weird. You might want to comment on that.
It's true. Yeah, it is hard to regulate. And again, it's very different for each province and territory. Yeah. So I can't even address all of it. It helps a province or a territory for the sake of bat conservation and putting any sort of regulation, or sometimes not even official regulations, but writing into the protocol that if you want to apply for a permit to work with bats, to remove bats from a building, that you have to decontaminate. That's often, as you kind of were saying, that's often how they get it. It's not in the law, but you simply don't get a permit, or your permit could get revoked.
Okay.
Protocol is that you need to decontaminate, or you need to report every bat job that you're doing. So some provinces are able to do that. There's always, of course, as you say, there's either deliberate neglect or there's just mistakes are made. And really what we're just hoping is that we're kind of all in this together. We all benefit from keeping bats around, both for the ecological role that they play, as well as if you keep bats around, then you keep having a job of having to remove bats from attics.
And I do hope, I hope people care more about bats than just the financial reason, but if not, then we'll take the financial reason and just, we need to protect these important species. There's so much bad news on this front. Do you have are there any lights, any positive news that you might be able to share in terms of, there's been a ton of research being done. Anything that you find particularly hopeful about this, about that we can see maybe to get through this and maybe bats will adapt, or is a treatment, or is there anything along those lines?
It's sometimes I have to shake myself as well and remind myself of some of the good news stories, because it does seem to be predominated by bad news. And the fungus has been detected in new places beyond its previously known range, and then soon after the disease shows up, and then soon after you start seeing dead bats everywhere. So it is all very, very sad. But yeah, the research community and the wildlife management community are doing amazing work to protect bats. So you asked, like, is there something like a treatment, for example? Not yet, but yes and no, I should say. So there are a lot of researchers in Canada and the US doing trial runs with these treatments. They usually start in the lab. And some of these have actually moved into mines to apply treatments there and see, does it actually work? Often these are volatile organic compounds, so basically a gas or a mist that they can spray into a mine that has some sort of antifungal components. Properties. So it's the aim is to basically just spray it in this site and then kill the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. Of course, a lot of tests are required because you want to make sure that you don't kill any other microorganism species. Right. It turns out that caves and mines, places where bats hibernate, are full of microorganisms, bacteria and fungi. And we know so little about the balance of it and how important these are. If you completely sterilize a cave, for all we know, it might not be useful for bats anymore.
Right.
So we need to be very careful with that. And so researchers and wildlife managers are very careful with that and are really just testing the water. They don't want to set something new loose. Some of these treatment options are bacteria, literally bacteria that inhibit the growth of this particular fungus. So we are talking about organisms that can multiply. So we want to be very careful that we don't start a new fire, basically.
Indeed. Are there is there any hope for bats developing natural immunity? Like, obviously this fungus is natural in Europe and the bats have been there for, I guess thousands of years or whatever the number is, and they've learned to coexist with this fungus. Any hope on any signs that that's happening with some of our bats here in the United States or North America?
Yeah, and I think that really is kind of the good news story. So even just superficial, this disease has been it was first discovered in North America in 2006, so it's been around for over a decade now, a decade and a half really. Again, starting in New York, and it basically shows in these hibernation sites anywhere from 85 to 99% mortality. So you might be thinking, well, where's the good news in that? The good news, I guess, is that it's not typically 100%. 99% or even 85% is ridiculously high. That is a massive population decline and cause to list these species as endangered. But there are some of these bats that are surviving. So that's kind of the superficial part. But so researchers have studied these bats. And it's research that goes way over my head, and it's not research that I've been personally involved with, so I can't really address it in great detail. But basically, it does seem that these survivors, they are genetically a little bit different from the bat carcasses that we receive all over North America. So there's something going on there, and that is potentially mimicking what may have happened in Europe. We don't know in Europe if there was ever a natural introduction of this pathogen and a crash in populations, and we're looking at a recovered population now, and it might be more likely, it's just been an arms race. The fungus and the bats have coexisted. The fungus tries to adapt to get a hold of the bats, but the bats adapt some sort of immunity. So yeah, some of our bats are genetically different. Somehow the fungus doesn't get a hold of them at the same level as it does to these bats that die. And so hopefully these bats will live on and reproduce and pass these better genes onto their offspring. Now that's where we really can make a difference, because the truth is, there, like I mentioned, there isn't really a treatment option yet for white nose syndrome that we can apply, no silver bullet. But we know some of these bats are surviving, and these bats are facing so many other threats. But those are typically the threats that we can do something about. So one of the threats applicable to your podcast here is bats being excluded from buildings in the wrong way or the wrong time of year. That's a massive threat, because we're talking often about, if you have a lot of bats, and people who want to get rid of bats in their attics typically have a lot of bats, that's a maternity colony most likely. Yeah. So those are females that are pregnant. They arrive pregnant in the summer. They give birth there. For an endangered species, that is, of course, critical habitat. Your attic is critical habitat to a bat. So we don't want to say, oh, you can't touch it anymore. The bats own your building now. Practices like that kind of exist in the United Kingdom. Sometimes if a bat's in your building, it's very hard to
really. Oh, I didn't realize it was quite that strict over there yet.
Pretty
tricky,
yeah. But here in North America, it seems, and again, it differs from state to state and province to province, but it seems that typically the regulation is, yes, you can get a professional to come in and remove these bats, but it has to be done in late summer, early fall. For example, our window here that we recommend in northeastern Canada is between like September and October, when the bats.
Oh, real? Okay. Interesting. September and so you're at September, October. Many locations here in the States, the blackout period is ends August 15th. So you can exclude after, I guess, on or after August 15th. But again, you're finding that bats can be hanging out even longer than that, out into September. Interesting.
Yeah, and it might be because of the climate here that the summers are shorter, so that even in the spring, when in a lot of places in the United States it's already quite warm, there's lots of insects out. Here in Canada, we might not see our bats come out of hibernation until May, for example. So bats might stretch their maternity season a little bit longer. And again, this depends on region. In some provinces, you might be able to exclude your bats earlier than later. But typically, we'd say ideally like mid-September, late October is relatively safe, because the issue, of course, is that if you do it before and you use these one-way tubes, the females, the adults, they fly out and they can't get back in. And now the babies that can't fly yet are locked in the attic, and they will starve to death. So it's also an argument, of course, for homeowners. You don't want it done any earlier than that, because you're going to lock bats in your attic, and now you're going to have an attic full of carcasses. That's not good for the bats. That's not good for you. Then the window, so it's a little bit more complicated if you're in areas where you have big brown bats as well. So we have little brown bats.
Yeah.
This is the skin of a little brown bat. This is one of those endangered species that's affected by white nose syndrome. We have big brown bats as well. That's not just a bigger version of this. It's actually a different species that happens slightly bigger. Now, the little brown bat is a bat that you typically find in attics, but they're typically only in there in summer. There are definitely some exceptions to that rule. Big brown bats, however, they are able to hibernate in attics, at least here in Canada. So that means that if you have bats, if you use any of these exclusion devices in winter or past October, and these bats are snug in there hibernating, you probably won't even notice they're in there. And now they use these tubes, they fly out and they can't get back in. That might actually doom them to die, because they don't have the energy to fly very, very far. So that complicates the story a little bit, where it really makes that window very short, where we're talking about September to October and early enough in the spring, when the big brown bats can just fly out, but the mothers don't have pups yet.
So you're looking at from a Canadian perspective, and I just want to make sure we're clear with everybody. Jordi is talking from a Canadian perspective. So the window for exclusion is quite small in Canada, where obviously in many parts of the United States, you could do exclusion sometimes from August 15th out to maybe, October, where if you're starting mid-September, if your recommended time is mid-September to the end of October, you got 6 weeks to do all those bat jobs. I guess I would say the only positive side of that is that here in the States, and I'll ask you about Canada, here in the States, typically what a wildlife control operator would do is he would secure the building except for the active exits. And then when he came back in August 15th, he would just slap the one-way doors on. It requires a second visit, and it can be a little bit of a hassle business-wise, but you don't have, you're done with the house. It's just a quick visit, slap the one-way doors on and leave. I guess someone in Canada do the same thing where they basically secure the house except for the openings that are being used, and then mid-September come up and just slap that one-way door on. Otherwise, if they had to do all the work in that 6-week period, they wouldn't be able to do many jobs.
Yeah, so when you're talking about securing the house, you're talking about making sure that the bats have no alternative routes.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Well,
they can't get in anywhere else. So you're closing all those holes, but you're leaving the ones that they're actively using alone until you come back to put the one-way doors on at the appropriate time.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that what I'm talking about is even more specific to some of the recommendations that we've written for Eastern Canada.
Okay.
I can't say that it's the same for Western Canada. The climates are a little bit different there as well. But yes, we do actually recommend that if a pest control operator has the time for it, to go out and observe the bats fly out of the building, indeed figure out what are these active entrances and exits that these bats use. Okay. And if there's any talk of bats coming into a living space, that's a completely different story.
Right.
If there's a risk of a bat sharing a space with a human or with pets, that needs to be dealt with straight away.
Yes.
So in that case, we would recommend that holes are plugged from the attic into the living space, or from the living space to the outside if bats are coming in that way, because you get into bats getting in contact with pets and with humans, and it's a bad story with the small but real chance of a bat carrying rabies.
Yes.
So yeah, there are definitely activities that just should be done and dealt with straight away. But when we're talking about really colony exclusion, wherever you are in North America, those dates that are set, that window should be set based on, this is when we're confident enough that the pups are able to fly. Because if they are able to fly, you put these tubes on for long enough, you give them a week or 10 days, you got to have enough days with suitable weather that you're sure that all of these bats would have left. Then it's totally fine. Then hopefully they'll find a different roost somewhere else. And then you can take the tubes off, plug those holes.
Yeah. Well, that's all very, so it sounds very similar to what we have here in the US. I'd like to transition, if we could, to some of the research that you did regarding the other threats. I mean, we see the white nose as the big boogeyman in the room. I mean, it's a big monster. There's no doubt about it. But you did some work in areas of that other threats that face bats. Why don't you talk to our audience about some of those other threats?
Yeah, that's right. And that's really that whole point of if we can't help bats survive white nose syndrome or not well enough, where can we help them? So first of all, we need to understand what other threats bats are facing. And there are many. So there's a lot of research that other folks are doing. I think wind farms is a big one that I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Slice and dice.
Yeah, so bats as well as birds, they have trouble detecting, seeing, or using echolocation to detect these spinning blades of the turbines, and they get struck by it. So there's a lot of research going on to figure out why are bats going up to turbines in the first place, because if we understand that, maybe we can do something to make it less inviting to them. So some of the thoughts that are out there are that a wind turbine looks like a giant tree to a bat. And a giant tree is the kind of tree that has good cavities, good holes in it. A lot of our bats are cavity roosters. Some from branches, a lot of them go into holes that naturally occur in there or under the bark. So we think a lot of these bats might be flying up to turbines because appears, they check it out. They think, oh, it's a tree. Let's check it out.
Interesting. So it's not, so let me just pause you there. So I thought that the bat issue was a migration issue or a bat hunting nearby and then getting whacked by the blades, but you're saying the bat may be actually attracted to it as a potential harborage space.
So the story is very complicated. There's possibly different things going on. So
I didn't hear about the living one. I thought that's just bizarre. Okay.
So it might look like a tree, so it might look like a good place to roost. It also seems that depending on the color of the wind turbine, it might attract a higher abundance of insects. Mm-hmm. So if the color attracts a lot of insects, then it attracts bats.
Sure. Right.
If you change the color to attract fewer insects, then you might attract fewer bats. And then the migratory bat story is often that wind farms are placed on in places where there's a lot of wind, which and on edges, so on edges of lakes, which are the kind of features that migratory bats use to migrate along. So unfortunately, the good places to catch the wind for wind turbines are also the places where migratory bats and birds go.
Right.
Plus, it might be, again, this visual thing that when bats fly large distances, they don't actually use echolocation. They just use their eyes because they have perfectly good eyesight. And it's good to have something to aim for. So you see the biggest tree in the landscape with a nice light blinking at the top. You aim for that. And then it turns out there's a spinning part to it. So not all of these things are proven. Like we can't dig into the mind of a bat and see that it believes, oh, this is a good roost tree. But those are some of the theories that are out there. But we also know that when most bats die by the hand of wind turbines is at low wind speeds, because bats don't actually like to fly when it's very windy. 10 miles an hour wind, basically, any windier than that. And they typically don't fly anymore, way fewer fly. So a mitigation strategy is to basically shut the wind turbines down when there's very low wind speeds and they're not generating a whole lot of energy anyway. So yes, there will be some energy generation loss, but it's relatively minimal. And it's basically a possible price to pay to save the bats. So some wind farm operators are actually very open to that and are doing that. They're stopping these machines in low wind speeds and they unlock them automatically when the winds pick up and there's fewer bats out anyway.
Wow. Okay. So 10 miles an hour. What about temperature? Is there certain temperatures that bats aren't flying at as well?
Typically as well. I don't know with the variety of species that you have in the US and a variety of climates there. Also, I don't know Fahrenheit, so I'm going to talk about Celsius.
Sure, talk Celsius, that's fine.
But we typically find that below, in this part of Canada, in eastern Canada, below 10 degrees Celsius, the bats tend to not fly that much anymore. But if you go further north to Labrador, where in basically the peak of summer, it could still be freezing at night, bats do still fly. So it depends on where you are. These temperature measurements and how bats are influenced by that are different depending on where you are.
Yeah, so 10 degrees Celsius is 50 degree Fahrenheit as a rule of thumb. So once you're starting to get 50 degree Fahrenheit or below, I think the rule of thumb that I've used is, if you don't see bugs, you're probably not going to see a bat. I mean, it's because there's not a whole lot of reason to be flying around to just scoop air or something, I guess. Although I do hear that they sometimes will come out of hibernation in the middle of the winter for a cleanse or a water to just, I don't know what they're doing in the middle of the winter time, other than they should be hibernating where they can come out and get some water, perhaps. Is that kind of what they're doing?
That's exactly it. Yeah. So when bats hibernate, they lower their body temperature so that they don't burn calories as fast as they would otherwise. But they still dehydrate at a slower pace, but dehydration is still a thing. So they actually naturally come out of hibernation every 10 to 15 or 20 days or so, because they're thirsty. And so sometimes in these caves or mines, there's high humidity or there's even an underground lake. They just fly through the cave, they drink the water there. Other times in other sites, they have to leave the site. And so bats can be seen even sometimes during the daytime in winter, flying over lakes and scooping up water, just drinking water, replenishing what they have lost. So that is pretty natural. Yeah.
So to take you on a little rabbit trail here, this has been a question of mine for a while. Here in the US, we have bats that will hibernate in people's homes, and we know that because we'll get calls in December where bats are emerging in the living space. Well, clearly it's had to have been staying there. And the question is what made it wake up? So is it water? They were searching for water, because we've also noted at times, there'd be a deep plunge in temperature on the outside. And our thought is that people are turning up the heat on their house, in that, are they waking the bat up with the heat, or is the bat looking for water? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, they definitely do wake up because they are aroused from hibernation. I try to not say wake up, because then
right. I got you.
But
be
yes.
more precise. That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm not using the right language here, clearly.
Because cool fact, bats actually arouse from hibernation to go to sleep. They still sleep. So that's a really cool thing. But yes, predominantly it's because, yes, they're thirsty. So that's one of the reasons they might arouse. I can't say for sure, but yes, increases in temperature, whether that comes from the heating of the house or what we see sometimes on warmer days in winter, we tend to get more reports of big brown bat sightings in winter as well. So either the outside temperature increases or the inside temperature increases, and that increases the temperature in the attic. That could definitely make these bats arouse from their hibernation, because a bat doesn't have a choice what temperature its body is. Its body is the temperature of the ambient environment in winter when it's in hibernation or in torpor, as we say. So if the ambient temperature around the bat increases, that forces the bat to increase its body temperature as well. And then it starts to burn fat reserves. So yes, it might actually naturally, when the temperature outside gets warmer, it might take advantage of that, because in some places it might mean some insects are out there as well. So it's a good opportunity to replenish a little bit. But when it comes from inside the house, of course, that makes this bat's body think, oh, there's a warm spell, I need to arouse, and I'll take a flight and I'll try to find some food. But actually it's still freezing outside and there are no insects there. I can't say why these bats end up in living spaces, because they knew which way they came in. Bats are very clever. They should know which way they come out. But that could have various reasons. Either that gap is frozen over. It could be a juvenile bat, a bat that was born that summer, that's a little naive, that took a wrong turn and ended up in a living space. Could be any or all of those things.
Sure. So you've talked about white nose syndrome, the threat of windmills, wind turbines. Are other threats that bats are facing?
Yeah, so many. Bats need, like any wildlife, typically they need healthy forested habitats. They need their trees. So keeping diverse old growth forest and mixed with hardwood and softwood forest, keeping those around is very important. So that's all, of course, up to wildlife management agencies and working with permitting with forestry industry, for example. But I think a big one relating to bats associated to buildings is predation by cats. Cats are we love them to death, but they are little murder machines. And outdoor cats are the big issue, of course, because you don't even know what your cat's doing. There are better stats on the number of birds killed by cats, and I don't know these off the top of my head, than there are about number of bats killed by cats, and that is because birds are simply more visible. It often happens during the day. But yeah, keeping your cat outside, especially at night or during dawn and dusk, is when they can do the most damage. The thing is that bats echolocate. So they use this high frequency noise to see in the dark. Even when it's pitch black, they can hear the reflection of this sound and make a mental map of their environment. It's a sound that's too high in frequency for our ears to hear, but cats can hear it. So cats have this perfect radar that they can just in the darkness hear bats fly around. And if they swoop too low, or if it's on a tree or something, just taking a break or eating, cats can get bats. And
cats can get it. Yeah. So I'm a little bit more negative. I mean, I like cats. I've owned cats, but they're indoor cats. I just tell people, look, if you hate the environment, folks, let your cat outdoors, and that shows us you hate the environment. But don't give us this nonsense that you care about nature, blah, 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 while you're letting your cat outdoors. It's just simply nonsense. So if you love nature, keep your cat indoors. And I would say if you love your cat, you'd keep the cat indoors as well. So because there's a lot of bad things that happen to cats outdoors. So that's enough of that. So we have cats. Have you other findings that you have in your survey?
Yeah, we so what I did is we have our wildlife health database. So working for the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, we've been around for longer than I've been in this organization. So I want to say at least since 1992. At least our data in our database goes back to at least 1992. So I just pulled data from the last 5 years. So this is all data gathered from bats that are found dead or that were killed by someone and that were submitted to us. Our pathologists basically do wildlife forensics. They open up these animals, they do all kinds of tests on them to figure out how did they die. So we have a wealth of information in this database on not just bats, any wildlife in Canada, on how these animals died. So I looked at the last 5 years to be current with the times, and did a deep dive and see what are the trends, what are the most common causes of mortality in bats. And so white nose syndrome, obviously one. Cat predation was a big one. But actually, also a lot of bats were killed by being found in a living space and just being killed. And you don't always, I have to say, sometimes, yes, the recommendation is if a bat's in the living space and there has been possible contact with you or with other people or with pets, public health often recommends to contain the bat, have a wildlife officer show up, and they euthanize the bat for testing, just for rabies, just to make sure. But otherwise, if there has been no contact, there's no need to kill the bat. And it's often just a matter of isolating the bat in a room. If it's flying, if it's nighttime, open a window or a door, switch the lights off, and the bat will find its way out. But there still seems to be a lot of just fear around bats, where the response or the feeling that a bat is vermin. It's a pest. So a lot of people respond by, oh, there's a bat in my living space. Where's the tennis racket? Or where is anything that I can, just so many stories of bats being stomped on, bats being hit by tennis rackets, baseball bats. And it was kind of shocking how many cases we had in our database compared to other causes of mortality. It kind of just stood out. So I think education is just important, and informing people. I want everybody to know the value of bats, that not only that they save us literally billions of dollars in our economy by the pest control that they provide by eating insects that eat our corn and our lettuce and our tomatoes and our potatoes, but just also how important they are to the natural ecosystem as well.
Yeah, here in the US, we have CDC protocols, and typically but we also have a lot of lawyers in the United States, something that you don't quite have the same problem in Canada as we do here in the United States. But our recommendation would be generally that the bat should be captured. Any bat in a living space should be captured in a manner that doesn't harm the brain. Because the other problem with the tennis racket, even if there was an exposure, a tennis racket may invalidate the test. So that's the problem. So the bat should be captured in a manner that doesn't harm the brain. And then that individual should be contacting health officials to talk through where they are in the protocol, and then determine whether the bat should be euthanized or whether the bat should be released.
Yeah.
And so that would be yeah, but I would be very nervous about just letting a bat out without, just because the liability side is so huge. But I hear what you're saying, because the fear that we have here in the US is if someone, 6 months later starts twitching, they're going to look for someone to sue. And that's going to be, well, you told me to let the bat out. Well, so we want to make sure that the health officials are the ones bearing the burden, because their liability insurance is going to be a whole lot higher than ours. But no, I think it's a fair statement that there is a lot of sometimes willy-nilly, just sometimes killing of bats where there was no need whatsoever. If like someone saw the bat fly into the house, well, obviously it wasn't there while you were sleeping if you watched it fly in. I mean, there's different scenarios, but I think that's well taken, that we need to be sure we're safe, but go through the process. Don't just willy-nilly kill a bat unless the protocol says that's what needs to be done. And that's a decision for health people to decide.
That ideally here in Canada too, the bat is captured and you call public health, and they can make an assessment. If it's clear no one's been in contact with the bat, then they will probably recommend to release it. Yeah. The situation, and I'm not public health, so I can't even make those recommendations on whether the bat should be killed or whether it should be released. But maybe from a health insurance point of view, it's a little bit different in Canada, that if either there was contact, there was contact, and then the bat flew out the window, or you released the bat too soon, then called public health and they said you should have held on to the bat for testing. If the bat's gone, then public health might make the recommendation you need to get your post-exposure prophylaxis. So basically a protective shot to a vaccine to protect you from rabies, because there's no way of now finding out whether the bat had rabies or not. That's correct. The chance is so small that it does, but if it did, if you do catch rabies, it's pretty much 100% lethal. So it's also pretty much 100% preventable if you do get that shot, but those shots are very expensive.
Very expensive.
And in Canada, it's more likely to be covered by health insurance.
Yeah. Well, here in the US, we may not have that even with Obamacare or something like that. Yes, without a doubt. So the key here, folks, be sure you follow the recommendations from your health department that governs your political entity, because we even have people listening in other countries besides Canada as well. So always follow your protocols. So here in the US, it's CDC, and you may have some other local ones from state and local areas. But as a rule, you want to have the bat. If a bat in the living space, capture it, then have a conversation with a health professional. And then everything can be handled in a very straightforward sort of way. And so let's say for the sake of argument that there was no exposure, and that's been determined by the appropriate health officials. There's no exposure. What is the best way to release that bat? What is your recommendation for how the bat should be released?
I'll start with taking one step back on first,
go right ahead.
Catch the bat, because we're talking about don't get in contact with the bat, right? So you need to catch a bat in your living space, then we don't want you to just grab the bat. You don't want any contact. So typically what I recommend, and I think I saw an old video of yours where you recommended that as well, is basically just what some people do for spiders as well. I mean, I honestly either leave the spiders in my home, or if they need to go, they go out alive. And you take some sort of box or a plastic container or something, you put it over the bat if it's roosting, if it's stationary, and then you slide a piece of strong cardboard underneath. Be careful that no part of the bat gets stuck, because they do have fragile little bones. So now you have the bat in a secure place, and ideally too, wear long
gloves.
Wear your leather gloves, gardening gloves. Try to not wear a t-shirt, have some long sleeves, just in case the bat crawls out, and you don't want it crawling over your hand, or if it does, you want some layer there. So now you have the bat. I'd say it's easiest during the night, because that's when you can basically just go out and basically just tip the container gently on a branch of a tree. You don't want to put it on the ground, because bats are not like birds. They're very bad at trying to take off from the ground because they don't have long legs. They have a membrane in between. Bats can't walk, basically. Mm-hmm. And they can't push themselves off very well. So put them up on something high. A rough wall surface might work as well. And then the bat likely will just fly. It might sit there for a while, but it likely will fly away, and hopefully before any sort of predator comes by. Right. During the daytime is a little bit trickier, and that's probably when you want to call your local wildlife agency, because they might either opt to have someone come pick up the bat, or they will say, but I don't want to say that, but if they say you can hold it in the container until nighttime and then bring it out and do the same thing, I don't want to make that recommendation on anyone's behalf, because I wouldn't feel comfortable telling someone, you caught a bat, now keep it around. Because bats are little escape artists, and I wouldn't want to risk having you have this container with a bat in your kitchen, and then when you go and release it, the bat's no longer in the container. But if you talk to an expert and they recommend any of those sorts of things, then follow those recommendations.
Yeah, typically we have we'll use a Tupperware container that has a good lid, and then if you want to be extra careful, you can duct tape that lid down. Put a T over it. And so, but anyways, we're getting a little far afield. Any other threats to bats that you found in your research? And by the way, is your research published? Are people able to view it yet?
Yes. So we have a website. It's easiest to Google. There's the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, but you can also go to, it's all acronyms, but it's CWHC-RCSF.ca. And we have a report section there. And so you can find our bat health report. So all of those data are in there. We did find a significant number of bats did die of rabies, or were found and then euthanized because they were showing weird behavior, and then they tested positive for rabies. Yeah. But I will put a disclaimer with that our data, just the bats that come to us, is very, very biased, of course, because we don't get healthy bats. This is not a snapshot of a healthy population of bats. We get the ones that are already dead or are already showing odd behavior. So disease shows up at a much higher frequency in our samples than it does in a actual representative sample of the population.
Yeah. So just to explain that to everyone, this is called selection bias in statistics. It's sort of like if you're trying to figure out, the number of criminals in society, you don't go to the prison and find and do a survey on criminality, because obviously there's a lot of criminals in jail. So that would not tell you what the rate of criminality would be for the whole population, because you're biasing your selection by going to a prison. The same way with a veterinarian. A veterinarian doesn't get animals that are healthy. A veterinarian's getting animals that are injured and sick. So that would not be a way to tell what the whole population is like. So they're getting the sick number of it. They're getting the sick animals. That's what he means by that. So yeah, that certainly makes sense. Did they ever go the next step and find out where that rabies was coming from? Were they always bat strain rabies, or were there ever any fox strain rabies or raccoon strains?
I don't think we always check, but I do know that typically in bats, we are talking about bat strain rabies.
Bat strain rabies.
Interestingly, though, because there seem to be, for every species of mammal that has contracted rabies, there seems to be a variant specific to that species. So silver-haired bat strain of rabies, for example, has been found in other species of bats. Right. So it's not always the particular strain that belongs to that species, and that's interesting. And I don't know why that is, but rabies does work a little bit differently in bats than it does in other mammals, it seems, because in foxes and skunks and raccoons, for example, there's an outbreak. Suddenly there's a bunch of these animals that have rabies, and then often wildlife managers tackle that and try to get rid of it. And so then the outbreak has been contained and it's been taken care of until the next outbreak. With bats, there's no such thing as an outbreak. It just seems that lingering in these bat populations, there's always very low levels of rabies there. So you don't get an outbreak where suddenly 30% has rabies, but there's just always, and that's where researchers have gotten a much more unbiased sample,
Right.
sample of bats, where they found that it's about 0.5% to 1% of any given population of bats could have rabies. If you have a population of 500 bats somewhere, then anywhere from 2 to 5 bats probably have rabies, but it doesn't seem to cause an outbreak because some bats actually seem to be able to clear the infection and survive rabies. Something
that's amazing. Yeah, it's because it is sort of weird. How is it that it persists in these populations for years? And yeah, you're right. I guess you don't hear of a outbreak of rabies among bats where you just have these mass die-offs. It's just strange.
Yeah, they're very amazing animals. There's so many diseases, like wildlife carries diseases.
Sure.
Bats are not really any different in that. We don't even really think that bats carry more diseases than other wildlife species do. But the diseases do seem to work a little bit different in them, that they can carry a lot of these diseases without getting sick and without dying. And that's interesting. That's also something that we want to understand, because if we can figure out what physiological mechanism allows these bats to deal with these diseases, with viruses, we can learn from that and potentially apply it in one way or the other in our medical field and help people.
So now that you finished this particular survey you did for 5 years, what is next? Are you looking to go back even further historically, or are you picking a different topic to kind of do? I mean, by the way, thank you for doing that historical data. It is irritating when data is being collected and never published, right? I mean, this is we have a lot of states in the US that collect controlled data from wildlife control operators. And my belief is, and I'd love to have a biologist listening prove me wrong on this, maybe your state will be different, but my suspicion is a lot of that data just gets stacked on a shelf and ignored. That's unfortunate. Why are you collecting it if you're not doing something with it? But I'm glad that you did this. What's for the future for you?
So we do intend to do regular, either annual or maybe every 5 years, take a look at the new data again. Mm-hmm. But the point of this was really to show that there are so many other things beside white nose syndrome affecting bats. And where we're working towards here in Canada with our national white nose syndrome program is we are turning that into a national bat health program. So it's not even a national bat disease program, it's bat health, because wildlife health is so much bigger than just disease. We're not just talking about diseases like white nose syndrome or rabies. We're talking about like wind farm. That's mortality, not caused by a disease. It's a different kind of factor. Deforestation, cat predation, that's not disease, but it affects bats in a negative way. Right. So we're working, Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative is a non-governmental organization, but we are working very closely and are being funded by provincial, territorial, and federal agencies. So we're working with all of these governments now to turn this white nose syndrome program into a bat health program, and really in a more coordinated effort, because there are researchers and wildlife managers doing their thing here and there to contribute to bat health, or our understanding of bat health and our management and improvement of bat health. But as a national coordinator, my job is to bring these things together to make sure there's coordination, communication between these, that we get the right smart people together to work on this as effectively and efficiently as we can. And really just improve bat health and make a difference where we can, in those places where we can't treat white nose syndrome directly.
Sure. No, it's a clever idea and pretty smart. Do you have any policy development? Are you looking to, as part of your role in your coordination of these various constituencies, to suggest or draft possible policies that would be adopted by provincial or perhaps the federal government? Or Do you have any role in that?
In a way, yes. So the governments do often look at our organization for guidance. We are not in any position to make regulations or policy to enforce.
Right. I was thinking that's why I said draft it for them to adopt.
Exactly.
Right.
So we on the topic of bats in buildings, we have worked with the governments in the Atlantic provinces to write comprehensive guidance on how to manage bats in buildings. And I am not a wildlife control operator or pest control operator. I'm a biologist. So what do I know? So we worked with the industry, got folks to review what we wrote. We provided workshops, which were both sharing what we like the best management practices that we were aware of and getting them to correct us in certain ways where they said that is not what that doesn't work in our profession. So we wrote those, and then with approval from the provincial governments, and those provincial governments are using our guidelines in their permitting process to provide permits to pest control operators and nuisance wildlife control officers, saying like, when it comes to bats, you need to follow these guidelines. So yes, we provide guidance that then the governments can turn into policy, or at least permitting restrictions, basically.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Any final words here as we begin wrapping up? Anything that you would like to have talked about that we didn't, that you would want to tell our audience here out in the Pest Geek Nation?
It's a dangerous question to ask a bat biologist or a bat enthusiast, or let's go as far as to say a bat nerd, because I can be here all night and
well, we can have you back in another show. That's not a problem. So we got lots of shows that we can do.
So much to talk about. I think I'll just for fun, I guess I'll mention, because I have this poster behind me, so in case have been eyeing that. So it says bat dependent food. There's lots of ways you can describe it. And it just comes down to selling the value of bats, basically, because there's so much that we take for granted. Just all these food items that we go to the grocery store, we buy them, and we don't even really think about where it comes from and how come we have that. So we already mentioned just the pest control service that bats provide by eating moths and beetles and flies, all these insects that eat our crops. So they save us billions of dollars in the agricultural sector by decreasing the populations of insects that eat our food. But it goes further than that, not in Canada, but in the southern United States, and definitely when you get into Mexico and Central and South America, that there are bats that drink nectar and bats that eat fruit. And by doing that, they provide important roles in dispersing seeds and pollinating. So by dispersing seeds and by pollinations, it's because of that we have mangoes and avocados and in an indirect way, even bananas. So lots of fruits and vegetables, one way or the other. We have to thank bats for having them. And I think the coolest fact there is through bats that pollinate is because of those we have tequila. There simply wouldn't be tequila.
Okay. Well, that'll probably got attention of some of our audience right there. So
yeah, the tequila is blue agave, which flowers at night, and bats are the only animals that are pollinating that plant. So no bats, no tequila, and that'd just be a sad Friday night.
If that doesn't convince some of our audience, I'm not sure what would. Well, thank you, Jordi Segers. Really appreciate you coming on the Pest Geek podcast. I do hope you come back again. So, all right, everyone, that you've been listening to Jordi Segers. He is the coordinator for the National White Nose Syndrome organization that's in Canada. So we have a sister organization here in the United States that's similar. He's the Canadian counterpart, and so he's been talking today about some of the threats and some of the research he's done compiling about some of the threats to bats beyond white nose syndrome. So we're really glad to have him on board. And just in terms of a favorable thing, I think a lot of our more mature wildlife control operators really do develop a respect for the animals that they're working with. And it certainly was, I do think that happens for many of the more mature ones. They realize that they're in awe of some of the animals that they're working with, and some of them are doing it because they really enjoy it. So I hope that gives you some hope there. Well, everyone, you've been listening to the Pest Geek podcast, Living the Wildlife with Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant. If you'd love to hear from you, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Tell us what you think of the show. Comments for future shows. If you want to be a guest, definitely reach out to me, give me a little pitch, and we're glad to talk about it because there's so many things going on in our industry. It'd be nice to get that information out. Do join us on Facebook with our Facebook page. You can join other pest control and wildlife control professionals, discuss the triumphs and wins of your work, and also get questions and technical advice there as well. And again, everyone, just to kind of close off, this is Living the Wildlife. We want you to live the wildlife because we don't want you to be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.